Good morning. So today we're continuing our series Overflowing with Joy, going through the book of Philippians. The passage we're going to look at today wouldn't be everyone's go-to passage when we want to talk about joy, as it talks about suffering for Christ. But as we see Paul's experience of joy in the midst of his suffering, it can help us understand just to what depths our joy can be possible. So I like to tell the story of when I was stoned for Jesus. I'm not talking about taking drugs. When I was in primary school, my dad was the leader of a church and most of the people on our street knew about it. One day I was in our garden and on the other side of our garden fence was a group of children a similar age to me. And I got into an argument about the existence of God with one of the boys. It went a little bit like this. God doesn't exist. Yes, he does. No, he doesn't. Yes, he does. No, he doesn't. You get the idea. Eventually, the boy got so frustrated with me that he picked up a stone and he threw it at my face. It hit me right there. At the moment it hit me, I pretended that I was fine and that it didn't hurt, but the shock on the boy's face made me realise that there was probably a problem. I went inside, I looked in the mirror and I saw this massive gash on my cheek, at which point I just burst out crying. When we think about suffering for Christ, the first thing that often comes to mind are people who follow Christ in countries where it's forbidden by law, or who suffer discrimination for being a Christian because they live in a country that's dominated by another religion. We should pray regularly for those who suffer in this way and have their freedom and sometimes their basic human rights removed for following Jesus. But the Bible is clear that suffering for Christ is to be expected for every Christian. There is a cost, and many of us, even in the UK, have lost friends and family members due to our faith, or have made lifestyle choices that are honouring to God, but that are also costly. If you're listening today as someone who's exploring the Christian faith, I haven't painted a very encouraging picture. But in today's passage, we see an example in Paul of someone who is suffering for Christ and yet full of joy. In some ways, his suffering even contributes to his joy. Let's read the passage and explore what is going on in Paul and how he has obtained such unshakable joy. We're looking at Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 down to 30. I want you to know, brothers, what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some, indeed, preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defence of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking to inflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretence or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not at all be ashamed, but that with full courage now, as always, Christ will be honoured in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. For I am to live, if I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labour for me. Yet which shall I choose? I cannot tell. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and to be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all, for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because of my coming to you again. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened by anything in your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe him, but also suffer for his sake. Engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. There's a lot in that passage. We're going to go through it as it takes us, looking at Paul's suffering and then his joy, followed by what he has to say to us. So last week, Andy touched on Paul's suffering. He mentioned that he was in his own kind of lockdown. Paul was in prison, he'd suffered physical beatings, he was away from loved ones and dependent on letters to communicate. There was also the threat of execution looming over him. Not only that, but we see from verses 15 to 18 that even others who preached the gospel, the very thing that he was in prison for, had a motive to stir up more affliction for him. Now, the passage doesn't give us details about this, but I found a couple of commentaries really helpful in fleshing this out a bit. One study guide suggests perhaps they were unimpressed with Paul due to his poor speaking abilities and constant weakness and suffering. The sermons in Paul's letters display him as a very impressive man. But what we do know is that, where am I? But he was known not to speak as eloquently as he writes. Another study suggests that these may have been people who were not impressed with his approach. Surely, going and getting arrested was not helpful for the spread of the gospel. The fact that Paul defends this idea in verse 12 suggests that may have been the case. We see, verse 12, it says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. D.A. Carson, in his book Basic for Believers, which is a study through Philippians, says this. They think that Paul has done damage to the cause by getting himself arrested. Probably they magnify their own ministry by putting Paul down. We can imagine their pompous reflections. It really is sad that so great a man as Paul has frittered away his gospel opportunities simply because he is so inflexible. After all, I and many others remain at large to preach the gospel. One must assume that Paul has a deep character flaw that puts him in the path of trouble. My ministry is being blessed while he languishes in prison. Thus, the more they speak, the more their own ways are justified, and the more Paul is made to look like a twit. All of those suggestions are what I would call educated speculations, but it gives you an idea of the sorts of things that the passage might be getting at. What we do know for sure is that the motives are not out of love and, as we are told, out of rivalry. And if Paul hadn't been preaching the gospel himself, there may not have been stirring up trouble for him or feel that he was a rival at all. This is another kind of suffering, where other people speak out against us because of our faith, because of a value or a belief that is attached to our faith or a choice we have made in line with our faith. In every kind of stage of life, as Christians, we are faced with these kind of dilemmas. I once knew a teenage girl named Helen who was at a friend's house for a film night. The film that was agreed upon by all of the rest of her friends was one that Helen just didn't feel sat right with her Christian faith. So she spent the evening sitting in the kitchen until the end of the film. You can imagine the comments made about her. When we stand for Christ, whether it is through speaking out gospel truths or through an action we take based on our values, we can be misunderstood and we can cause offence even to friends and families, and that hurts. It happens all the time, and it should be expected. Timothy 2 Timothy even, 3:12, it says, indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ will be persecuted. In my first year of student life, I lived in a halls of residence. And I made some great friends. Our halls were split into blocks of five, into blocks of flats with about 5 people living in each flat. And I lived with a Sikh, a Hindu, a Greek Orthodox, an atheist, and then there was me. We had a lot of late night discussions and debates discussing our different faiths and worldviews. It was really interesting and I learned a lot. One day, I was travelling into uni with a mutual friend, and he told me that one of my hallmates thought that he was going to hell when he dies. He then asked me outright, "Do you think I'm going to hell?" Everything in me wanted to say no, but I knew that I couldn't in good conscience. I told him that I believed Jesus and faith in him was the only way to heaven. He took this to mean that I did believe he was going to hell. I lost a friend that day. So for a talk that's meant to be about joy, we're probably not feeling that joyful right now. Here's the thing. Paul's joy was astounding. Verses 18 to 19 of the Bible. Here we go. In every way, whether in pretense or truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. And yes, I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. And then the passage goes on, and it's like Paul starts thinking aloud. We get this insight into the way he thinks. He's thinking, what would I prefer, living or dying? Because both are brilliant. One means he gets to be with Christ. The other means he gets to serve Christ. I don't know about you, but my focus would be, I don't want to be executed. It might hurt a lot. And I don't like life, suffering in prison either. But for Paul, both options bring great joy. Why? What are his reasons for being so joyful? It's the gospel. If you look at Paul's reasons to rejoice, they are all centred around the gospel. That God came to earth as a man, Jesus, lived a perfect life on our behalf, and then made a way for us to be restored into relationship with him by offering us forgiveness through his death and resurrection. This was Paul's joy. The gospel is at the centre of his prayers, which we can also see earlier in the chapter, verses 3 to 4. I thank God in my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, for you are all making my prayer with joy because of your partnership in the gospel. The gospel is at the centre of his aspirations, which we can see through his rejoicing that the gospel is being preached, even though those that are preaching it are bringing him down. He's not concerned about his own reputation. He doesn't want Paul to be known. He wants the gospel to be known, Jesus to be known. And the gospel is at the centre of his relationship with other believers. Verses 15 to 16. Oh no, 25 to 26. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, in the gospel. The gospel is at the centre of Paul's life and is his absolute joy. So what does this mean for us? What is at the centre of your life? What is your joy? Because if the answer to that is in something that can be taken away when we suffer for it, there is no joy. But if our joy, like Paul, is set in the gospel, it will remain even when we suffer for it, because it can never be taken away. And like in Paul's experience, it can even advance. Towards the end of our passage, in verses 27 to 28, it says this: Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. Now, when it says that, I don't believe it's saying this is a sign to them that they're going to hell and you're going to heaven. I think what it means and what it's getting at is it's saying it's a clear sign to them of their own hearts and the state of that and where they're at, but that their salvation is possible because they can see it in you. It's a sign to them that there's hope for them, even though they're currently going down the route of destruction. So I mentioned Helen, a teenage girl, earlier. She was a prayer warrior. She suffered a lot of slack for her unwavering trust in the gospel, but was not frightened by her opponents, as Paul instructs us not to be. She prayed, and through her many prayers, and through her, others also responded to the gospel. When your joy is in the gospel and the gospel is advanced as a result of your suffering, there is even more joy to be had. Now, it is hard to talk about joy in the midst of suffering. We're talking about joy alongside suffering. We're not talking about joy that takes it away or replaces suffering. We're talking about the two together. We're not saying that if you're suffering for whatever reason, you should be going around with a smile on your face, because it is suffering. And Paul tells the believers to expect it. Verse 29, for it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him but also suffer for his sake. I've got a friend at the moment who is currently suffering intensely. For her, it's not suffering because of the gospel, it's due to a very traumatic past. But I want to share something that she said last week, because her experience of joy and suffering is an example of how joy can be known in the depths of suffering, whatever the reason the suffering is there. This is what she said. The last couple of days have been really hard. I've not been okay. I've really known Jesus with me for hours. I just really knew him, sat with me in an amazing way, just with me, knowing that he knows when I don't have the energy to use words, just sitting with me, holding me together while I was weeping. In the midst of everything being so awful, Jesus is with me, and that's good, really good. I feel there is a really deep peace, even a joy, the joy of the Lord being my strength, not a joy I can do anything about. I can't read or write or speak half the time, but it's not about me. Yesterday was a dark day, yet a light day, one of the darkest days there's been for me, but at the same time, how can it be dark when I'm sat with Jesus? I've experienced Jesus, Emmanuel, in amazing ways over the last week. He is gentle and strong, not making things better. Actually, I've been more not okay this week, but he's been sitting with me, not saying or doing anything, just with me. Suffering brings up a lot of unanswered questions. What we do know is that there is a cost to pay for being a Christian in this world. There's also a lot of other suffering in this world. But Jesus is alive. He is with us, and he enters into the midst of our suffering. The gospel is amazing, can never be undone, and will remain unshakable, giving us unshakable joy when it is at our centre. If we were meeting in the flesh this morning, I'd be asking the musicians to come and play us a few songs so that we could have some time to reflect and respond to anything that God has been speaking to you about or stirring in your heart during our exploration through this passage. I just want to encourage you, if you are someone who is suffering or is facing a dilemma where you know that there's a cost to count if you make a choice that is in line with your Christian faith, that is in line with honouring the gospel and with Jesus. I just want to encourage you to take some time today. Don't just at the end of this service just get up and carry on with your day as normal, but do take some time to reflect, to pray, to pour out your heart to God, to give it to Jesus, because he is there in it with you. I'm just going to finish by praying. Father, I just want to pray for anybody listening this morning who can relate to this passage, anyone who is currently going through suffering, whether it's for you or whether it's not for you, and anyone who is facing a dilemma in that. God, I just pray that you would meet with them this morning, and pray that you would know, that they would know the presence of Jesus in the same way as my friend has this past week. I pray that you would enter into their suffering with them and be beside them. And I pray that they would know joy as they are reminded of you and of the gospel. Father, I pray for all of us that we would come to know the same unshakable joy that Paul knew and was able to enjoy in every single circumstance that he found himself in. Amen.